"Your translator is lying," the waitress whispered into the ear of the millionaire CEO in the middle of the restaurant, mid-negotiation. The contract, in German, was about to be signed. Everything seemed in order. But that one sentence changed everything. Nicholas Vaughan arrived at the Oakwood restaurant in London a few minutes before the agreed time, not out of anxiety, but out of a need for control. He always liked to arrive at places before they filled up. That way, he could observe, gauge the atmosphere, and size people up. The restaurant was sophisticated, quiet, one of those places where everything seemed too expensive to touch carelessly. For Nicholas, it was just a setting. What truly mattered was in the leather folder he carried in his right hand. He sat at the reserved table by the window. The view showed the city in full motion, traffic flowing along Regent Street, hurried people, decisions taking shape in unseen places. He opened the folder calmly. The contract was there, thick, in German, an agreement that had been negotiated for months and could elevate his company to a new level. Nicholas didn't speak German. He had never needed to. He always relied on professionals for that. The translator was already there. A well-dressed man, relaxed posture, almost exaggerated confidence. He greeted Nicholas firmly, sat down without waiting for an invitation, and began to speak before anyone asked. He commented on the traffic, on the city, on how demanding investors could be. Nicholas listened in silence. That self-assurance didn't bother him. On the contrary, it seemed a sign of competence. "They'll be here in moments," the translator said. "Everything is aligned." Nicholas nodded, closed the folder, and rested his hands on the table. He liked clean, organized tables, without an excess of objects. For him, clarity began in space. He ordered only water. The translator ordered wine. The waitress approached with discreet steps. Young, simple uniform, correct posture. She served the water, arranged the glasses, and asked if they wished for anything else. Her voice was low, professional, almost neutral. Nicholas responded with a brief gesture. There was no reason for more. Beatrice moved away without haste. She was accustomed to being just part of the atmosphere. She had learned early that in places like this, the less noticeable she was, the better. She observed everything without seeming present. She walked to another table, took orders, and returned to the counter. The investors arrived shortly after. Formal greetings, handshakes, contained smiles. German began to dominate the table. The translator naturally assumed the role of intermediary, repeating in Spanish what was said in German. Nicholas listened attentively, following the rhythm of the conversation. Everything seemed to be proceeding as expected. Beatrice returned with the wine. She served the guests first, then Nicholas, and finally the translator. As she leaned in to reach a glass, she heard loose words in German. Nothing complete, nothing clear, just fragments. She didn't react. She continued working. The conversation progressed. They spoke of deadlines, deliveries, commitments. The translator translated fluently, using a confident tone, sometimes overly confident. Nicholas took brief notes. He didn't understand the original language, but he understood negotiations. He trusted this process. It had always worked that way. Beatrice passed the table again, collecting empty glasses. She heard another phrase in German, then one more. They weren't difficult words. They were common, known, used in serious contexts. She felt a slight unease but pushed it aside. It wasn't her role to interpret other people's conversations. She returned to the counter and organized plates. The restaurant was already full, but Nicholas's table remained in its own silence, a silence of importance. Everything there seemed calculated, measured, under control. Nicholas observed the investors, contained gestures, attentive glances. There was no hostility or exaggerated enthusiasm. It was a professional agreement, nothing more. He liked that. Clear business, no drama. The translator continued to speak, sometimes occupying too much space in the conversation. He interrupted, explained, summarized. Nicholas saw no problem. That was his function, to translate, adapt, facilitate. Beatrice returned to serve a dish. As she placed the cutlery, she heard German again. This time the phrase was too complete to ignore. It wasn't something technical. It was a tone, a weight. She felt her body react before she could think. Still, she kept her face neutral and moved away. She took a deep breath behind the counter. She tried to concentrate on her work. She didn't want to invent stories in her head. How many times had she misinterpreted things out of context? How many times had she been wrong? The conversation continued. The translator spoke naturally. The investors listened attentively. Nicholas remained calm, confident. Nothing indicated any problem. Beatrice observed from a distance, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. She had grown up in a home where German was not used for trivialities. It always appeared when something serious needed to be said. That was etched in her, even if she didn't notice it. At the table, Nicholas closed the folder for an instant, listening intently to one of the investors. The translator translated quickly. Nicholas nodded. Everything seemed in order. Beatrice felt the unease return stronger. Still, she did nothing. It wasn't the moment. Perhaps it never would be. The restaurant continued to operate. Plates came and went. Parallel conversations took place, but that table remained in an invisible spotlight. An important contract, important people, important decisions. Nicholas suspected nothing. He trusted the process. He trusted the translator. He trusted his own experience. Beatrice was still there, almost invisible, performing her function, listening to fragments, retaining sensations, not yet knowing that in that very place, at another time, everything would change. For now, nothing was happening, and precisely for that reason, everything was yet to happen. Beatrice crossed the dining room with a tray balanced on her left arm, hot plates, aligned glasses, contained steps. She had learned early to walk without occupying space in the restaurant. That made the difference. Those who drew too much attention ended up being overheard, and being overheard, there was rarely a good thing. Nicholas's table remained intact, same arrangement, same people. The translator spoke non-stop, leaning forward as if leading the conversation. The investors listened attentively. Nicholas maintained a firm posture, arms resting on the table, gaze direct. He seemed comfortable, in control of the situation. Beatrice served one of the dishes and moved away. She didn't linger, she never did, but after 2 steps, she heard a phrase in German, escape louder than usual. Not whole, just the beginning, enough to recognize the tone. She didn't react. She continued to the counter, took another order, and returned to the dining room. The restaurant was full, laughter at some tables, loud conversations at others, but that table remained isolated, as if surrounded by an invisible bubble. The translator laughed, spoke quickly, translated quickly. Beatrice passed by again, now with water. As she approached, she heard another phrase in German, this time longer. The investor spoke calmly. The tone was not light. The translator responded in Spanish with words that were too soft. Beatrice felt a slight tightening in her chest. She paused for half a second, just long enough to place the glass correctly on the table. No one noticed. She returned to the service area, took a clean cloth, and wiped a surface that was already clean. She needed to keep her hands busy. When she was a child, she would sit on the kitchen floor while her grandmother stirred coffee on the stove. Her great-grandmother would sit at the table, hands clasped, looking out the window. When they started speaking in German, Beatrice knew it wasn't playtime. She didn't need to understand everything. It was enough to hear the manner. The language sounded harder, the phrases short, the silences long. In the restaurant, the sound was the same. Beatrice returned to the dining room with another order. She passed near the table again. The translator interrupted the investor mid-sentence. He translated something quickly, abridged. Nicholas made a brief note on the paper. She felt the unease grow, but she kept walking. A colleague crossed her path in the aisle. "Big table today," she commented in a low voice. Beatrice nodded. "Important client, it seems." Her colleague shrugged and moved on. For her, it was just another demanding table. For Beatrice, it was no longer. She approached again, now to collect empty plates. The investor spoke in German. He used a word Beatrice recognized well. It wasn't rare, it was common at home. It always appeared when someone warned about a risk. The translator translated it as if it were just a technical detail. Beatrice felt her stomach churn. She didn't think about the contract. She didn't think about money. She thought about her grandmother, saying that word never came alone. It always brought consequences. She collected the plates carefully. One of the investors watched her for an instant. Beatrice kept her face neutral, didn't avert her gaze, didn't smile, showed nothing. She returned to the counter. The manager rushed past her. "Pay close attention to that table," he said. "There can be no mistake." "Yes," Beatrice replied. "Mistake," the word echoed. She observed from afar. The translator gesticulated more now. He spoke loudly, laughed. Nicholas remained serious, listening, sometimes asking questions. The translator responded too quickly. Another phrase in German crossed the dining room. This time, Beatrice recognized 2 words together. The tone didn't match the translator's smile. Beatrice squeezed the cloth in her hands. When she was little, her great-grandmother used to say that certain things were said in German precisely so that the children wouldn't understand. But Beatrice understood enough. She always had. She had never considered it important. Until now. She passed the table once more, serving coffee. The investor spoke slowly. Jeremy Reed translated quickly. Nicholas nodded. Beatrice almost tripped as she moved away. She regained her balance before anyone noticed. Her heart raced, not out of fear of falling, for something else. She leaned for an instant near the kitchen. The clatter of plates helped disguise her thoughts. She didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to create problems. She knew how things worked. People like her weren't asked for opinions, but this wasn't an opinion. Jeremy Reed made a joke. The investors smiled slightly. Nicholas did not smile. Beatrice returned to the dining room. The conversation continued. The contract remained open on the table, pens aligned, everything ready to proceed. She heard another phrase. This time there was no doubt. The tone was one of warning. The translator translated it as if it were mere formality. Beatrice felt her face burn. She looked around. No one seemed to notice anything. To everyone there, that language was just foreign noise. To her, it was a warning. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of her great-grandmother. She thought of how they had never studied that language, but they knew how to use it at the precise moments. She thought of how they had never told her that it might be useful for something. She felt a weight on her shoulders. She still didn't know what she would do. Maybe nothing. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but the feeling wouldn't leave. She remained there, serving, cleaning, listening. The language no one else seemed to hear kept speaking, and Beatrice kept listening. She stopped near the kitchen door when she heard the word again. This time it came clear, whole, without a doubt. The investor spoke carefully, as if measuring each syllable. Jeremy Reed responded too quickly. She didn't need to translate word for word. The meaning came with it. That wasn't a technical detail. It was a condition. It was a risk. It was something that at home never went unnoticed. The translator laughed. Beatrice felt her stomach contract. She returned to the counter and pretended to organize orders. Her mind, however, was far away. For the first time since she had started working in that restaurant, she couldn't ignore what she heard. Not out of curiosity, but because now she understood enough to know that it wasn't irrelevant. The investor spoke again, using another familiar word. It wasn't complicated, it was common. It always appeared when someone spoke of loss, of limits, of something that couldn't be reversed later. The translator translated it as if it were flexible. Beatrice pressed her fingers against the counter. She remembered her grandmother saying in German that certain things only seem small until they pass the point. She remembered her great-grandmother slamming her hand on the table when someone tried to soften something too serious. In the restaurant, no one slammed the table. Jeremy Reed was speaking loudly now, confidently. He interrupted the investors naturally. He took the lead in the conversation. Nicholas listened, sometimes frowning, but remaining attentive. Beatrice passed the table again, collecting napkins. The translator gave her a quick, impatient glance, as if her presence was a hindrance. He said nothing, just continued speaking. She heard another longer phrase. This time there was no doubt. It defined responsibility, defined control, defined who would lose if something went wrong. The translator translated it as if it were just a legal formality. Beatrice felt her heart race. Now it wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just a memory. It was understanding. She knew she didn't master the language. She knew she didn't know technical terms. But she also knew when someone was downplaying something that shouldn't be downplayed. She returned to the kitchen with short steps. She leaned near the sink. The sound of the water helped hide the silence in her head. She thought about leaving. She thought about asking to change sections. She thought about pretending she hadn't heard anything. She thought about her job. She needed that job. She needed the shift. She needed the salary. She couldn't afford to create problems with an important client. She couldn't get involved in a conversation that wasn't hers. The manager passed by her. "Pay close attention," he said. "Will they ask for more wine?" "Yes," Beatrice replied. She returned to the dining room with the bottle. As she approached, she heard the investor say something in German, now with a firmer tone. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a warning. The translator translated it with a smile. Nicholas asked a short question. The translator answered without consulting the investors. Beatrice noticed it. It did not go unnoticed by her. She served the wine. The translator didn't even thank her, just continued speaking. Beatrice moved away and felt a mixture of fear and indignation, not for herself, but for what was happening right there in front of everyone. without anyone noticing. She began to piece together the puzzle. She didn't know details, she didn't know numbers, but she knew that something important was being diluted, that a heavy clause was being presented as simple, that someone was leading that conversation more than they should. The translator moved like the owner of the table, correcting, adjusting, cutting interventions, choosing what to translate and how to translate it, and he did so with too much certainty. Beatrice remembered how at home German was never used to deceive. It was used to warn, to protect, to prevent mistakes. Here it was being used in reverse. She felt like going to the table. She felt like saying something, but the image of the manager, of her job, of her salary, came along. Fear quickly prevailed. She was no one there. Nicholas was the CEO. The investors were important foreigners. The translator was the hired professional. She was just the waitress. Who would believe her? She heard another phrase. This time she didn't even have to think. That changed everything. The translator translated it vaguely, almost generically. Beatrice felt a chill down her spine. She moved away from the table and went to the back of the dining room. She leaned against the wall for an instant, pretending to observe another table. Her heart pounded. She still didn't know what she would do, but she knew that if she remained silent, something serious would be decided there without the full truth being on the table. The conversation advanced towards closure. The translator began to speak of next steps, signing, schedule. Beatrice took a deep breath. She had no proof, no authority, no place in that conversation. She only had what she had heard, and now she knew exactly what it meant. The table was overly organized, papers aligned, pens carefully positioned, glasses refilled. The translator spoke as if already concluding the matter. The tone was that of someone leading to the end. Beatrice perceived it before any words were spoken. The investor spoke in German once more, bluntly. It was no longer a warning, it was a confirmation, the kind of phrase that at home was accompanied by silence. Then the translator translated quickly, cutting the weight of the phrase in half. Nicholas nodded. That was enough. Beatrice felt her body react before her head decided. One step, then another. The tray was light, only empty cups. She walked towards the table, as she did so many times a day. No different gesture, no haste. The translator continued to speak. She approached Nicholas's side, leaned in just enough to reach the table, like someone about to clear something. The smell of coffee was still there. The noise of the restaurant remained normal. No one paid attention. Beatrice got close enough for only him to hear her. Your translator is lying. She didn't explain, didn't repeat, didn't raise her voice. She didn't wait for an answer. She straightened up, collected the cups, and moved away. The world didn't stop. The restaurant continued to function. Someone laughed at another table. A waiter rushed past behind her. Nothing changed for those observing from outside. But at that table, the air became different. Nicholas didn't move immediately, didn't look at Beatrice, didn't react, just remained still for an instant, longer than normal. The translator continued speaking, unaware. Beatrice felt her legs tremble as she turned her back. She walked to the counter with contained steps. Her hands were cold. Her heart was beating too loudly for the rhythm of the dining room. She knew what she had just done. She also knew there was no turning back. The translator finished the sentence and smiled. He expected agreement. Nicholas took a moment to respond. He closed the folder calmly, not completely, just enough to interrupt the flow. Repeat, he said in English. The translator blinked, surprised. Of course, he said, adjusting his posture. I was explaining that. Repeat what he said, Nicholas interrupted, pointing to the investor. The investor spoke again in German, slowly. The translator translated. Nicholas listened without noting anything, just observed. Beatrice, from the counter, followed everything. She pretended to wipe a glass. She didn't look directly at the table, but she listened to every change in tone. The translator began to justify himself more than before. He added words, adjusted phrases. Nicholas listened in silence again. He then asked, in simple German he had learned on old travels, a single word, a test. The investor replied. The translator translated too quickly. Nicholas looked up for the first time, not at Beatrice, but at the translator. Let's take it slowly, he said without haste. The translator nodded, but his smile was no longer the same. He ran a hand over his shirt collar, took a sip of wine, spoke less. Beatrice felt the weight of the decision fall on her shoulders. Now, all that remained was to wait. There was nothing more she could do. There was no point in regretting it. Beatrice moved to the back of the dining room when the manager approached. What did you say over there? He asked in a low voice. Beatrice swallowed. Nothing important, she replied. Just mentioned about the coffee. The manager frowned, suspicious, but didn't press. The table was too important to cause a scene. Jeremy Reed now spoke more carefully. The investors exchanged brief glances. Nicholas asked objective questions, one by one. Beatrice observed from afar, feeling time stretch. She knew she could be fired that very night. She knew they could call her, interrogate her, expose her. She knew that perhaps no one would believe her. Still, she didn't regret it. The translator tried to close the conversation more than once. He spoke of the schedule, of signing. Nicholas closed the folder completely. "We'll leave it for another day," he said. The translator's eyes widened. "But everything is in order," he quickly insisted. "It's just a formality now." "No," Nicholas said dryly. "It's not." The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. The investors looked at each other. The translator opened his mouth to speak and closed it again. Beatrice felt the air grow denser. Nicholas stood up calmly, thanked the investors, apologized for the postponement, and said he would be in contact. The translator tried to follow him. Nicholas didn't respond. Beatrice cleared the table after they left. Her hands trembled less now. The fear was still there, but something different was mixed with it. Awareness. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if they would call her. She didn't know if she would lose her job. She just knew that at that moment, she had done what needed to be done. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm. Other tables, other orders, another ordinary night. But for Beatrice, that phrase still resonated short, direct, with no turning back. And everything from that point on began to change. Nicholas did not return directly home that night. He left the restaurant as he always left important environments. Without haste, without giving explanations, without looking back. He greeted the investors with contained courtesy, ignored the translator when he tried to approach again, and got into his car with the same neutral expression as always, but inside, something didn't fit. The journey to the office was silent. No calls, no music, just the constant sound of the engine and the thought that kept returning to the same point. The low voice. Firm. Without trembling. "Your translator is lying." It wasn't the content of the phrase that most disturbed him. It was the absence of interest in it. There was no request, no drama, no attempt to convince, just a warning. Dry, precise, like someone who knows they won't be heard, but speaks anyway. Nicholas parked in his private spot and went up alone. The building was almost empty, few lights on. The kind of silence that only exists after important decisions have already been postponed. He entered his office, left his jacket on the chair, and stood for a few seconds, motionless, looking at the table. The contract was still there. He didn't open it immediately. He sat down, clasped his hands, and took a deep breath. For years, Nicholas had trusted two things above all: numbers and technical people. He always believed that danger came from emotions, not from well-trained professionals. And the translator was exactly that. Experienced, recommended, overly confident, too confident. The memory of the restaurant returned with more clarity now. The simple questions, the overly long answers, the haste in leading, the visible discomfort when Nicholas asked for a clause to be repeated. Nothing scandalous, nothing obvious, but enough to leave a crack. He turned on his computer and opened the contract. This time not to proceed, but to observe. He read it calmly. He didn't understand technical German, but he understood structure, sequence, rhythm, and something there seemed misaligned. Not in the text, but in the execution. He picked up the phone. "Call legal first thing tomorrow," he told his assistant in a neutral tone. "I want an independent analysis of the contract, discreet, no fanfare." "Any specific urgency?" she asked. "Just for precision. Report without interference," he replied. He hung up. The next morning he arrived earlier than usual. The company was still waking up when he was already sitting, reviewing old emails related to the negotiation. Nothing jumped out, no obvious error. The kind of trap that only works because it looks clean. The legal team entered shortly after. "I want you to review this as if you knew nothing," Nicholas said, pushing the contract across the table. "And I want a parallel technical translation, line by line." "Today?" the lawyer asked. "No rush," Nicholas replied, "but no carelessness." The lawyer nodded and left. The day progressed at a strange pace. Nicholas participated in meetings, signed minor documents, answered messages, but his thoughts never strayed, not from the contract, but from the waitress. He tried to rationalize. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that the human brain seeks patterns where none exist, that it made no sense for a young woman serving tables to identify something that went unnoticed by investors and professionals. And yet, the unease remained. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang. "Mr. Nicholas," the lawyer's voice said, more subdued than normal. "We are still analyzing, but there is something I need to tell you." Nicholas straightened in his chair. "Speak." "There is a clause that does not match the way it was presented," he explained. "Nothing explicit, but the practical effect is different from what was verbally presented." The silence on the other end stretched. "Different how?" Nicholas asked. "In case of operational disagreement," the lawyer said, "decisive control passes to other hands for a determined period." Nicholas closed his eyes for a second. "That was mentioned." "Not in the way it is written," the lawyer replied. "And if applied, it generates a significant strategic detriment." Nicholas didn't respond immediately. "Continue," he finally said. "We are requesting a second external translation," the lawyer added. "But this already raises a red flag." Nicholas hung up without thanking him, remaining motionless, looking at the city through the window. The lights were starting to turn on down below, one by one. He felt something strange, not anger, but cold. The phrase returned now with a different weight. "Your translator is lying." It was no longer a loose warning, it was a starting point. He picked up the contract again, not in a hurry, not with anxiety, but with method. The same method that had brought him there. He still didn't know the extent of the trap. He didn't know who was involved. He didn't know how far it went. But he knew one thing. Someone tried to manipulate him, and someone, improbably too insignificant to ignore, saw it first. Nicholas leaned back in his chair. 2 days. That was the time he gave himself. 2 days to be certain, to confirm, to understand. And meanwhile a question hammered silently, uncomfortably. How many times had he trusted loud voices and ignored those who spoke softly? The second day began with silence. No calls from the investors, no messages from the translator, no attempts at pressure. The kind of calm that doesn't reassure, only conceals. Nicholas arrived early, again, earlier than any other executive, not out of anxiety, but out of method. He knew that important decisions are not announced, they are revealed little by little. The legal team was already in the building. "We received the external translation," the lawyer said, as soon as Nicholas entered the room. "Independent, technical, no contact with any of the parties involved." "And?" Nicholas asked bluntly. The lawyer opened the folder carefully. There was no dramatism in his gestures. That alone was a sign. "The contract is not illegal," he began. "It's worse than that. It's ingenious." Nicholas remained silent. "The clauses are drafted to appear balanced," the lawyer continued. "But in practice, they transfer decisive power at critical moments. Nothing immediate, nothing explicit, only when it's already too late." "Was that said at the table?" Nicholas asked. "No," the lawyer replied. "It was softened, adjusted. Some keywords were omitted in the oral translation." Nicholas rested his elbows on the table. "Confirm," he said, "that the verbal translation was different from the original text." The lawyer nodded at strategic points. "Yes." Nicholas closed the folder. There was no explosion or visible surprise. Only confirmation. "I want everything," he said, line by line, comparative. "And I want to know how long that translator has been working with that group." "We're already looking into that," the lawyer replied. "There's a recurrence." That word hung in the air. Recurrence. Nicholas left the room without saying more. He walked down the long corridor of the company, ignoring automatic greetings. His mind worked in layers, as always, in real crises. It wasn't just a compromised contract, it was manipulated trust. It was someone betting that he wouldn't ask too many questions. And, most importantly, it was someone counting on the silence of those who had no voice. In the mid-afternoon, he called the translator. "I want to clarify a few points," he said on the phone. "Tomorrow morning." The response came too quickly. "Of course, Mr. Nicholas, I'm at your disposal." Confident, comfortable, the same tone as always. Nicholas hung up. He didn't need to confront him yet. The truth was already clear. The next step wasn't to accuse, it was to observe. Meanwhile, Beatrice continued to work. The restaurant was full that day. Business lunches, controlled laughter, important conversations in low tones. Beatrice circulated among the tables as always, attentive, discreet, invisible, when she needed to be. But inside, her body was on alert. Since the day of the contract table, nothing had happened. No reprimand, no call, no warning. The silence now weighed heavily. She wondered if she had done the right thing, if she had exaggerated, if she had misinterpreted. Her fear wasn't of the millionaire, it was of what would come next. She knew these kinds of places. She knew how mistakes weren't announced. They were punished in silence. She served coffees, cleared plates, avoided looking towards the table where it had all begun. When her shift ended, she left quickly, as always. Nicholas observed from afar. He hadn't gone to the restaurant that day by chance. He sat at a discreet table, ordered something simple, and remained there, more attentive to the people than to the atmosphere. He saw Beatrice working, her contained manner, her excessive care, her body always a step back, as if not wanting to occupy space. Nothing about her demanded attention. And yet, it was she who perceived what an entire room did not. He didn't call her, didn't signal, didn't approach, not yet. At the end of the day, he returned to the office with another piece of the puzzle fitted. The confirmation arrived in the early evening. The legal department sent the final report. There was no longer any doubt. Jeremy Reed had lied. Not about everything, not crudely, but enough to steer decisions, to gain time, to create dependence, to favor interests that were not Nicholas's. Nicholas read the entire document without skipping a line, then closed the file. He didn't feel relief. He felt something heavier, the realization that if he had signed that night, he wouldn't have noticed the error until it was too late, and that if it hadn't been interrupted, no one would have taken responsibility. No one, except the young woman who had nothing to gain by speaking. He leaned back in his chair. 2 days. 2 days had been enough to confirm everything. Now there were choices. The first would be to deal with the translator. The second, more delicate, would be to decide what to do with Beatrice, not as an impulsive reward, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real consequence. He didn't want to create a pretty story. He wanted to correct a structural flaw. He looked out at the city. The fraud was proven, the risk contained, control recovered. But what bothered him most wasn't the avoided harm. It was the question that now wouldn't leave his head. How many decisions had he made throughout his life, based only on who spoke the loudest? The next day, Beatrice was called in mid-shift. There was no explanation, just a discreet request from the manager, in a tone too neutral to be reassuring. "They want to speak with you out there." She felt her stomach sink, washed her hands more carefully than usual, adjusted her apron, took a deep breath. She thought of everything she could have done wrong in the last few days. She thought of the warning. She thought of the silence that came after. She thought that perhaps she had overstepped. Nicholas was waiting outside the restaurant, leaning against his car, away from the tables. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Still, his posture left no doubt. Beatrice recognized him instantly. She stopped a few steps away. "You wanted to speak with me, sir?" she asked in a low voice. Nicholas nodded. "Ah, yes," he replied. "If you have a few minutes." She also nodded. She didn't ask why. She didn't apologize. She just stood there waiting. "I want to start by saying one thing," he said. "You're not in trouble, Beatrice." She breathed a little easier, but didn't relax. "I asked for an independent verification of the contract," Nicholas continued. "It took 2 days, and it confirmed what you said." Her eyes widened. She didn't know how to respond. "The translator lied," he said bluntly. The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice began, but stopped. She wasn't absolutely certain. It just sounded wrong. "It was wrong," Nicholas affirmed. "And it wasn't obvious." She lowered her gaze. "I was afraid to speak," she confessed. "I didn't think anyone would listen to me." "Yet you spoke," he replied. Beatrice shrugged, uncomfortable. "I didn't think about anything after that," she said. "I just thought that if it went wrong, at least I could sleep. If I didn't speak, no." Nicholas remained silent for a few seconds before asking, "How did you learn German?" Beatrice hesitated. That question didn't sound accusatory. It sounded curious. "At home," she replied, "with my grandmother and great-grandmother." He looked at her attentively. "They were German descendants," Beatrice explained. "My great-grandmother spoke almost all the time. My grandmother mixed it with English, but when it was serious, she switched languages." She smiled slightly, without realizing it. "When there was a problem, when there was a difficult decision, when someone was ill, they spoke in German." "So, you grew up hearing that," Nicholas said. "Yes," she replied. "Not as a study, but as a part of life." She paused. "I never thought it would be useful. I always believed it was just a family thing." Nicholas felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't uncontrolled emotion, it was belated recognition. "You apologized that day," he commented, for interfering. Beatrice nodded. It wasn't my place, she said. I serve tables, not contracts. Who told you that? Nicholas asked. She remained silent. Life, she replied after a few seconds. Nicholas took a deep breath. Do you know what bothered me most about all this? He said. It wasn't the attempted fraud. It was realizing that no one at that table was prepared to listen to someone like you. Beatrice didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how. I came back here today, he continued, because I needed to understand if what you did was coincidence or character. She looked up. It wasn't bravery, she said. It was discomfort. Nicholas nodded slowly. That's what almost everyone runs from, he replied. They remained silent for a few seconds. The distant city noise filled the space between them. I don't want you to feel indebted, Nicholas finally said, nor for this to become a nice story to tell. I don't want that, Beatrice quickly replied. I just did what I believed was right. I know, he said, and that's why I'm here. He was direct. I want to offer you an opportunity, he said. Not now, not as a reward, but as a path. She frowned. What kind of opportunity? An entry-level position in my company, he replied. No high-ranking role, nothing symbolic, real work. And along with that, paid studies, languages, training, whatever you choose to develop. Beatrice took a moment to respond. I don't have a university degree, she said, referring to her CV. Do you have listening skills? Nicholas replied. And attention. The rest can be built. She took a deep breath. And if I say no, you continue your life, he replied. No punishment, no demand, but I prefer you say yes. Beatrice looked at the ground, thought of her grandmother, thought of her great-grandmother, thought of how many times she believed that what she carried was worthless. I accept, she finally said, but not out of gratitude. Nicholas smiled slightly. That's the only correct way to accept, he replied. She extended her hand. He shook it. Nothing was announced. Nothing was promised beyond what was possible. When Beatrice returned inside the restaurant, her shift seemed the same. The tables were identical, the customers indifferent, but she was no longer the same. And neither was Nicholas. Nicholas announced nothing, called no press, made no internal communiqué, did not turn what happened into a corporate example. For him, it was not a victory, it was a course correction. The translator was quietly removed. No scene, no public humiliation, just a brief email, suspended contracts, revoked access. The kind of exit that doesn't make headlines but closes cycles. The German investors accepted the pause. The independent verification changed the tone of the conversations. The contract was rewritten, clearer, fairer, less comfortable for those who tried to operate in the dark. Nicholas returned to routine without fanfare, but something in him did not return to its old place. In the following days, he began to observe more, not in search of errors, but of silences. He started to notice who came and went unseen, who spoke softly, who was interrupted, who asked for too much permission. It was a new, persistent unease. Beatrice started at the company 2 weeks later. No symbolic position, no announcement. A simple role in the administrative area, close to the flow of documents, where information passed, where decisions began small. On her first day, she arrived too early. She sat in reception a few minutes before time. Backpack on her lap, contained posture, attentive gaze as always. When she was called, she stood up a little too quickly. Good morning, she said upon entering. Nicholas stood by the table. Good morning, he replied. Please make yourself comfortable. She didn't feel comfortable. She only sat when he indicated. Her body still carried the habit of not occupying space. This here is not a favor, he said directly. It's a beginning. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn, and no one is going to spare you that. I don't expect to be spared, Beatrice replied. Nicholas nodded. Excellent. She started without ceremony, learned quickly. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She observed before speaking. When she spoke, she was precise. Some were surprised. Who is she, they asked. New, they replied. Just that. Nicholas made sure not to interfere. He didn't follow her closely, didn't praise her in public, didn't protect her. He observed from a distance. Beatrice didn't want to be an exception. She wanted to be capable. At night, she studied formal German, technical English, concepts she had only heard from afar before. For the first time, she felt that what she had carried since childhood was not a strange detail. It was a foundation. It wasn't easy. There were days when she thought of giving up, when she felt out of place, too small for that environment. But she always remembered the moment in the restaurant, the silence after the phrase, the weight that a low voice can carry. Nicholas also changed without announcing it. He started asking for double translations, listening less to prepared presentations and more to simple questions, distrusting excessive certainty. He didn't become kinder. He became more attentive. One afternoon, he crossed paths with Beatrice in the corridor. She was carrying a pile of documents, too concentrated to notice his presence. "Beatrice," he called. She stopped immediately. "Yes? How's everything going?" he asked. She thought before answering. "Difficult," she said, "but fair." He looked at her. "That's the best kind of beginning," he replied. She moved on. He remained. It wasn't gratitude he saw in her. It was responsibility, something rare, something he himself had almost lost over the years. The contract was finally signed weeks later. This time without haste, without celebration, only certainty. Nicholas held the pen for a second before signing, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. He knew exactly where he was stepping. When he finished, he closed the folder and stood up. He didn't think of the avoided harm. He thought of the restaurant table, of the young woman who had nothing to gain, and how much he almost lost by trusting only those who spoke the loudest. That night, leaving the building, he saw Beatrice crossing the street, backpack on her back, quick steps, tired but firm. She didn't see him, and that was fine, because this choice was never about recognition. It was about listening, and about the kind of leader he decided to be from then on. Sometimes, the biggest lie is not written in any clause. It hides in the way we learn to listen, or rather, in the way we choose not to listen. At that table, there was everything that power usually demands: experienced executives, attentive investors, a translator too confident to be questioned. Everything seemed under control. But danger doesn't usually present itself with fanfare. It comes disguised as normality, as excessive confidence, as a rush to conclude. And it was precisely there, where everyone felt prepared, that no one perceived the error. No one, except someone who had no place at the table. Beatrice wasn't there to give an opinion. She wasn't there to negotiate. She wasn't there to be heard. She was there to serve. And perhaps that's why she listened better. She didn't hear isolated words. She heard the tone, the weight, the subtle omissions that only someone who grew up hearing that language in difficult moments could recognize. While everyone trusted the correct translation, she perceived what was not being said. And even knowing she could lose her job, even knowing no one would believe her, even knowing that wasn't her place, she spoke without spectacle, without a long explanation, without trying to convince. She spoke because silence would cost her more dearly. Nicholas spent his entire life believing that command came from technical preparation, from a CV, from a strong presence, and that was never a lie. But that night, he learned something that no executive training teaches. Authority does not guarantee vision, and the louder someone speaks, the easier it is to ignore those who speak softly. The contract was almost signed. The trap almost worked, not out of incompetence, but out of habit. The habit of always listening to the same people, of trusting the same voices, of assuming that talent goes hand in hand with status. When the truth came to light, Nicholas could have moved on as if nothing had happened. He could have treated everything as luck, or as a punctual deviation, but he chose to stop. He chose to review not just a contract, but his own way of seeing the people around him, because he perceived something uncomfortable. How many important decisions had he made ignoring those who seemed irrelevant? How many opportunities had he lost because no one taught him to listen outside the hierarchy? This story is not about a corrupt translator or a millionaire CEO. It's about attention, about the hidden value in those who observe in silence, in those who don't interrupt, in those who learn without knowing what for, and about how much the world loses when it only respects those who speak loudly. In the end, Beatrice didn't gain an opportunity by saving a contract. She gained it because someone, for the first time, decided to see beyond the role she occupied. And Nicholas didn't become a better man by correcting a financial error. He changed because he learned something more difficult. The danger is not making mistakes. It's making mistakes without ever hearing those who tried to warn you. And now I want to ask you, if you were in Nicholas's shoes, would you have listened to that waitress? Or would you have trusted once again only in those who seemed prepared? And if you were in Beatrice's shoes, would you have had the courage to speak, even knowing you could lose everything because of it? Tell me in the comments what the biggest lesson this story left you with. I'd love to read your answer. Also, tell me where you're joining us from. If this story made you reflect, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because here you'll find stories that are not just for listening, but for thinking. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next story.